Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
When we look at something as aggregating data and selling it and making the conclusion that that's all bad, that's not all bad. Just because a vendor does that, that doesn't mean that he's a black hat. That doesn't mean that your PII is going to get sold up and down the street. That's just what the vendor does. And after all, he's got to make money too. My point is simply this. If the consumer understands that he does that, if the consumer understands why he does that, and what controls and best practices he does, I think everybody's happy, or at least everyone is informed. I'll say that.
Although an integral part of IoT security, IoT privacy doesn't rely on tech. It relies instead on self-imposed business rules that govern the way the collected data is used within and outside of the enterprise. As with many things tech, government and law is unable to keep up with the innovation of IoT and with what some call its digital exhaust. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with privacy expert Dale Smith about the top 5 best practices in handling personally identifiable information and other IoT privacy issues.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is for business leaders and managers employing the Internet of Things for their business or the business of their customers. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair, and I interview the industry's leading authorities to find out how they use IoT to improve business and create value. If you like this show, subscribe to it on iTunes and go to iotinc.com to check out my complimentary articles, videos, meetups, and webinars. It's time for another episode of the Pivot Podcast, the semi-fictional story about real opportunity and the possibilities of the industrial internet. Coming from our sponsor, GE Digital. Yeah, GE Digital. Search out the change if you haven't heard about it yet. So in the podcast, we meet back up with Ethan and Sam as they discuss the challenges of starting a company. Bad brainstorms, working with clashing personalities, and something I have a few scars from, navigating the world of co-founding. This episode also has a great interview with Ori Inbar, founder and CEO of AugmentedReality.org, a global non-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing AR and wearables. He shares his thoughts on starting an organization and on the future of AR. So go to the podcast section of iotinc.com to check out episode 4 and the earlier episodes if you need to catch up. They're a lot of fun and they're really informative too. With me today on episode 31 is Dale Smith. Dale has been an engineer, programmer, banker, entrepreneur, salesman, fund manager, angel investor, and retiree. Presently, he's a staff futurist and CCO at PrivacyCheq, and that's a startup that specialized in privacy solutions for the Internet of Things. Now, we've had a couple episodes on security, so I thought it was time to dig into privacy. Dale, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what is CCO? What is that part of your title? Chief what officer?
That's Chief Compliance Officer.
Ah, okay. So I guess compliance is a big part of privacy, or maybe just explain the relationships between the two.
Well, compliance, of course, implies that there's someone to comply with, which implies regulation. And
Got it.
When there are regs out there, it's important that when you're collecting PII or personal information, you do what those regulators would have you do. In many industries, I would say maybe in all industries, the role of a CCO is becoming more and more important. Since we started this company which is now 2 years ago, that's the role I've taken. The IoT application, of course, is newer because IoT coming to the forefront more recently.
And from a regulation point of view in IoT, what are you seeing? What are the bodies that are actually doing regulating, or are there any doing any regulating now?
To be very honest with you, I think it's a subject that everyone talks about, and no one has a clue what to do about it.
Including the regulators, you're saying, you're implying.
Well, I don't want to be unkind. One of the things that I've done in my role here at PrivacyCheq is to pay careful attention to what regulators or would-be regulators say when they make speeches. And those speeches, of course, always contain a need for you to treat privacy well, for you to employ best practices, but always down near the end, comes a bit of a plea for someone to please figure out a way to make this thing work.
Before we have to get involved, is that it?
That's kind of it. If you look at what's happened in practicality, in the real world, there are a lot of people talking about making rules. There are a lot of people throwing best practices around, but no rubber is meeting the road. I'll say that's not fair. Little rubber is meeting the road.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think I've seen a few things, maybe at least one thing from the FCC, where they've been addressing IoT privacy directly. I mean, obviously you've seen that. I don't know. What do you make of the starting direction, or at least the starting posture of the FCC?
Well, it's at a very high level. It really talks about the concepts of privacy by design, which is essentially saying, as you guys are designing this thing, design privacy into it.
Okay.
What isn't defined is what does that mean?
Right, I was about to ask you that. What exactly does that mean? Privacy by design versus security by design. I can get my head around that. But privacy by design, what's your take on it?
Well, for a year, we scratched our head on privacy by design, and one thing you have to learn about our group, we're techies. We build stuff. So we have actually just completed the design of a product that has privacy designed into it. Let me detail just a bit. You're familiar with what's called a privacy policy.
Sure.
They come in the mail. They're all over websites, and most often, they're long, they're complicated. They're written by lawyers or tended to be written by lawyers. When a consumer looks at that, his eyes tend to glaze over.
Yeah, totally.
What he tends to look for is the box that says, I agree.
Yeah, so, where is that thing? Yeah.
So he finds the box and he checks the box that says, I agree. But after that, when, let's say it's an application, a mobile application starts asking him for what's your name, what's your address, where do you live, and things of that sort, PII, there's a little bell in the back of his head saying, what did I just sign up for and what did I just do?
Yeah.
What I characterize that, or I say we as a company, is that's a disconnect. In our opinion, there's a huge disconnect between what regulators see as a proper privacy policy and what a consumer can understand as his privacy rights and best practices.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree 100%. I mean, I think the audio quality of this podcast for our listeners isn't going to be quite as high because I just updated my desktop that has my whole audio rig to Windows 10, and I'm just not able to. It keeps on crashing on me, so I had to reinstall a couple of the applications that I use, Skype, and then I use Pamela for Skype is how I actually do it with the software. And yeah, same thing. I got, from Microsoft, I got the privacy just, maybe 45 minutes ago. And I tell you, I don't even click on these things because I know intuitively that I'm not going to be able to understand them. Or I should say, I think everybody can understand them if they put the time into understanding them. But I guess the return on putting that time in, it just isn't there for me. And I can tell you, I agree with you 100%. I'm just looking for that, I agree, check mark or agree button and just continue on. And I guess that does illustrate kind of one of the bigger issues in privacy today, doesn't it?
We see it as an opportunity, Bruce.
Good.
Again, we're techies. We heard the call from the regulators or would be regulators to bring something to bear to make this disconnect go away. Yeah. And that's what we've been busy doing all summer.
Well, great. Well, this is a good point. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and specifically your background in IoT?
Well, full disclosure, this is my third career. I started as an engineer, then very quickly got into programming. Mm-hmm. Very quickly climbed onto the IBM personal computer. Right. Had a company for 24 years, sold that to a large company. Retired for 16 years, and came to the point where mobile became very attractive as something to do with my brother, and we see IoT now as a tremendous opportunity going forward. And honestly, I'm tired. I've played all the golf I can play. I've flown my airplane. I've gotten too old to fly my airplane. So it's been a good thing to get involved in IoT. It is new, IoT. No one can say that they're steeped in it for 20 years. Right. What I guess I would admit I have been steeped in for 20 years is a consumer perspective. I think that IoT, even more than normal products, involve the consumer. Right. And if you take the consumer out of the equation, it's like the sound of one hand clapping. There's nothing going on. So what we've tried to do is to look at the IoT privacy situation from the consumer standpoint. And that's where we are right now.
Interesting. Well, you've given us some interesting parts of your background. Tell us something that most people don't know about you.
Well, if you look at my business card, it says that I'm a futurist. And a lot of people look at that and scoff, and it is kind of funny. But I'll just quickly. I'm an old guy. I was born in 1941. Okay. That is, I was born right before Pearl Harbor was attacked, and that puts me as exactly 5 years before being a baby boomer. Baby boomers are defined as starting in 1946.
Right, okay.
I've always been fascinated by technology. In 1961, while at school, I began writing programs. I've written hundreds of programs. That's the good news. The bad news is they're all in Fortran. But I did start a company that we were a service bureau using mainframe computers in the late 60s, early 70s. Mm-hmm. And I had the good fortune to be on the ground floor of the IBM personal computer when it was announced in 1981. Yeah. I then was able to build an application. We basically introduced PCs into branch banks around the world. Sold that company in 93, became infatuated with the internet in 95, became even more infatuated with mobile computing in 2007. 2012 brings us to privacy, and here we are in 2015 with the privacy and security conundrum. Here's my point. As a futurist, I see where we are right today as a tipping point in our society going forward. The tipping point involves the digital trust of the consumer as he looks at where his information is going when he gives it to the IoT device that he's just purchased or linked up with. So the thing that I guess a lot of people wouldn't understand or wouldn't know is, as a futurist, I think this is absolutely an inflection point in our society.
And it's an inflection point leading to where?
It's an inflection point leading to having the privacy security conundrum being solved.
Okay.
I don't see it. Well, if you look at the gulf between a privacy policy, a 5-page privacy policy that the consumer absolutely refuses to look at or understand, and something that the consumer could look at and fully understand, right now, that's a pretty wide gulf. I think there's an opportunity to begin to build a bridge of trust between the consumer and the manufacturer. Many manufacturers look at this and they say, well, look, the lawyers wrote this. I don't want to tell the consumer any more than I have to. It's a negative thing. I'm going to take a defensive position. And a lot of people feel that way. I would say probably the majority of manufacturers, I won't say they feel that way, but their actions show that. However, here's the inflection part. I think smart companies will begin to say, if I can show my customer or prospective customer that I have a white hat on and I'm doing the best practices to do this, then I can build trust and join hands with him and now make good privacy practice part of my brand, which is where he needs to get to build trust going forward.
Good. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Let's kind of back up a little bit and start from the beginning. What is your definition, or I should say, what do you consider the differences between privacy and security, and then it's their relationship to each other?
If you Google that, I'm sure you have, you get pages and pages of definitions. I send out a Christmas card each year, and this year, one of the things I had on it, I sent it out as an e-card, is these words: privacy is difficult to define, but you'll recognize yours if and when you lose it. Again, that's looking at privacy from a consumer standpoint. You can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. Okay. So if there is privacy, the obverse of that is security focuses on the data and privacy focuses on the individual. And I see a lot of people, I won't say that they're confused by this, but often they haven't taken the time to think through the fact that privacy is of the individual. It's you. Right. And security is not necessarily you. It could be cops at the door. It could be guarding the mainframe from a terrorist. Many different things. But if you're concerned about your privacy, that's what you need to take care of first.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that definition because, I usually just point to data security is about protecting the data, similar to what you said, and then privacy is about establishing rules and regulations to protect that data, from people on the inside almost. So it's almost like security, you're protecting that data from people on the outside, and privacy is almost like you're protecting that data from other people within your organization. So defining the rules and regulations. But I like the perspective that you bring up and say privacy is about the individual. And looking at it from that perspective, I think that's a good way of kind of looking at the rest of the interview here, is thinking about it from the perspective of the individual. So, okay, well then I like that, and let's just get into best practices. What do you see? I asked this with a number of the podcasts that we had before this one on security. I'm going to do the same thing here. What would you say are the top 5 best practices to follow with regard to privacy?
Bruce, recently, 3 months ago, when we began our privacy by design in this current product, I went out across the internet and looked for lists of best practices for privacy, and I found 47 of those.
Okay,
and that's all the way from the Federal Trade Commission's definition to an industrial and industry definition to perhaps you had one out there. I don't recall. So you can read many lists of best practices. I've tried to make 5 of my own, which are, I'm not sure they belong on any of these lists, but let's try it out. First of all, everyone talks about transparency. I hate the word transparency. I think it's an empty word. I think it's like throwing a blanket over God knows what. You really don't know what's in there. Transparency implies that you can see what's in there, but it doesn't go to talking about whether what's in there is good or bad. Here's my best practice number 1. Educate, not obfuscate. Okay? I think that a good practice is to summarize a privacy and security policy for the consumer's review pre-purchase or pre-download. In other words, I think it's a good practice for the manufacturer or vendor, whoever is offering the IoT product, to have available a summary, at least, of the privacy conditions that he has pre-purchase or pre-download. No more check the box. I'll just say this: if you check the box, you ought to be better informed. Okay?
Yeah. So you're saying display it before they download, so they're not checking the box. Although they may still have to check the box legally, but you're saying educate them in advance. Okay.
Yeah. We're not saying a check the box goes away. That certainly needs to be there. But a little bit of information up front. For instance, let's say that there's a price tag or a little bit of a branded tag on the device, and they're on the shelf in a hardware store. Why not put a QR code there that you could zap the QR code and right on your phone it says, this product takes this PII, it does this, and it does that, and it does that. Right there before you buy. So you could actually compare product A with product B with product C.
Yep. No, I like it. It. All right.
Third is what I call a golden rule. Go ahead.
So what was 2? I mean, I have educate, not obfuscate. But what was number 2?
Provide a summary, pre-buy, pre-purchase, and pre-download.
Got it. Okay. All right. Number 3 then.
Number 3 is that if you're in the IoT manufacturing business, you should treat PII data as if it were your own. What I mean by that is if you wouldn't put your data at risk, let's say unencrypted or unmanaged in a certain situation, then you shouldn't do it for your customers. Very simple rule. It's a golden rule. These are kind of hokey, and I hope you'll bear with me. Another one I have come up with is what I call a digital mayonnaise rule. It goes like this: treat PII as if it were digital mayonnaise. Don't acquire more. Don't acquire more than you need. Store it for as short a time as possible in a proper environment. Then dispose of it promptly and safely before it can take on a life of its own. I'm sorry. It's a little levity there, but the problem that I think a lot of people run into, manufacturers, they're busy designing their product. They're busy making their product work and getting it to market and getting it sold. So all of a sudden, here comes this data over the internet, and we just say, oh well, we'll just put it over here, and that's where it is. Knowing that data is coming, planning for it, and seeing that it's not abused is really, really important. I think it's the best practice. That's why I put it up front.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, and I think you bring up 3 important points that maybe are now scratching, down a little bit. So acquiring no more than you need. Now, how much you need?
Yes.
How much you need. You don't necessarily know what you're going to need in the future, and I think it's tempting specifically, if you get the sales and marketing people involved, they may be asking for a lot, but I think that is a good practice. Don't acquire more than you need. But storing it, I assume that's going to be directly related to security, or is there something on the privacy side there that I'm missing?
Well, no, it's on the privacy side as well. You don't store it unencrypted if you can help it.
Okay.
Don't leave your mayonnaise on the counter. You need to put it in a refrigerator. That type of a thought.
Okay.
And dispose of it properly. Rarely do you see a privacy policy that says this is exactly what we do with your data when we're done with it. Rarely see that, but that's pretty important.
But now, are enterprises ever done with it? I mean, are there rules that they have to be done with it, or why not just keep it forever?
Well, there are not rules, but if you're going to keep my data forever, could you tell me that? I'd like to know.
That makes sense.
Forever is a long time for PII to be floating around, and these are best practices now. That doesn't say that these things are easy to do, but from a consumer standpoint, if you're going to take my data, I would like to know how long you're going to keep it.
Yeah, no, and I think inverting this for our listeners, those that are either vendors who are producing products for enterprises, or they're enterprises who are putting together their own IoT product to either sell or use internally. If internally, okay, maybe that's not to the same, it's not going to be as important to the same extent. But I think these are 3 good, 3 good pieces of advice. Don't acquire more than you need. How you're going to store it and dispose of it, and how you're going to dispose of it properly. I think that's 3 important things to keep track of. I think the other ones, they're obviously important too. Transparency, or more educate, not obfuscate. That makes sense. You want to let people know what's going on and put a summary up front. Like you were saying, treat it as if your own. Yeah, that makes sense. If your data was going to be captured by this system, would you feel comfortable? And I think that's a gut check that makes sense. And then the digital mayonnaise, I'm loving that one. All right, what's number 5?
Promote self-regulation. In the beginning of the call, you asked me about regulation. I really believe that self-regulation is where this is going, where it has to go. If you look at other components of privacy that have been regulated or attempted to be regulated, children's privacy, for instance, has been regulated since for years, and
like online privacy, you mean?
Online privacy, and that regulation has not been successful.
It hasn't.
No, well, they don't regulate it. They don't
enforce it.
They don't enforce it.
And has it been able to keep up with the pace of the technology change? I mean, I would see that as also a potential issue with regulated regulations, or I guess
it's certainly
legal regulations versus self-regulation.
It certainly is. If you put yourself in the shoes of a regulator, they've got a tough job. They've first of all, they've got to satisfy a whole bunch of politicians and interest groups, and they have to stay on top of the technology. It's honestly nearly impossible. To my way of thinking, the very best way that the IoT industry can move forward is embrace self-regulation and get on board with that. Educate each other. Essentially, they should be part of a solution, not part of the disconnect that exists today.
No, I think that's an important point, Dale, because if you just look out, if you look into the future a little bit, and I am talking to a futurist here, if the IoT industry as a whole doesn't self-regulate itself, it will be regulated, and therefore, and I think looking at it from an FCC point of view, and I know that's a U.S. perspective, and we have listeners all around the world, so I'm not as familiar with the other government bodies such as the EU, but they're saying basically, well, you should be looking at this stuff and you should be taking care of it. Otherwise, we're going to have to get into it and we're going to regulate you. And that's it's not a threat by any means, or maybe it is to a certain extent, but not a malicious threat. It's just one saying, get your act together or we're going to force you to get it together, or we're going to force you to get it together. Is that a perspective that you share, or do you have a different view on that?
No, I totally share that, Bruce. And I think that that vendors, the vast majority of vendors are white hats. They want to do this the right way. They don't want to rip off customers. They would like to improve the relationship that they have with the consumer. Yet, if you take a security breach, today someone breaks into Bruce's company. Tomorrow, everybody who's in that business, that same business that Bruce is in, is looked upon with suspicion, and that's not right. If the white hat thinking in the industry gets together, I think they can very easily improve their brand and improve the consumers' trust of the whole industry.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Now, let me circle back again, because I'm just thinking back to the difference between privacy and security, and my thinking has been evolving a little bit on this. But do you see privacy as part of security, as a subset of security, or do you see these as two different things, or is that really a moot point anyway?
Well, I see them as two different things. If I buy your product and it doesn't take any PII from me, now it's moot. Maybe you have my name and address, but you can find that in the white pages and the yellow pages. It only begins to become important when you begin to take my location and my age and my health and my heartbeat and a very long list of things here. Now it becomes, I'll use the word toxic to handle that PII. Okay? And the more toxic information that you as a vendor take, the greater the security risk to me.
Yeah. No. Okay. Yeah. No. And I guess I kind of see it separate as well. But I've been looking at it from a different perspective, and privacy may be having a technology component to it, and I do want to talk about that. And maybe this is a good point. This is a good place to talk about it. So, what are the technology design for privacy? What are the technical components of privacy, or are there? I mean, you were just. I know that you're about to launch or just launched your product by the time this podcast is released. What technology is there to serve privacy versus to protect the data? I mean, maybe you can just sort of go through that a little bit.
Well, I think it's all about education, Bruce. I think it's all about transfer of information. Let's characterize the way things are now. On the website, on the vendor's website, let's say, this is a typical vendor, not every vendor, on it is this 4 or 5 page boilerplate lawyer-produced statement of privacy. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
On the other hand, here's a customer ready to buy, ready to use your product. He's got a nice iPhone in his hand. He's got an iPad in his hand. He knows how to use all that stuff. He knows how to look at a visual presentation. You've got a tremendous canvas out there to begin to educate him and to build trust between the vendor and the consumer. It's almost like forming a bit of a contract. It's not a legal contract, but it's a virtual contract that says that the vendor says, look, Mr. Consumer, in order to serve you, in order to delight you with this device I'm giving you, I need to know these things about you. Mm. And the consumer, if he's well informed, says, you know what, I understand that. I understand we're not going forward unless I let you know where I am. So if we can build that understanding in terms of a conversation or at least a display for the consumer, if we can build that conversation right away, the consumer's opinion of that brand begins to become enhanced. And once he begins to trust that, now it becomes a plus, a positive to the brand that the consumer, that he's able to educate the consumer rather than just ignore him and push him away.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, I'd maybe extend, a best practice number 6 is if you believe, as I believe, that there's an explicit exchange of value between the vendor and the consumer. And the exchange is, if I give you this PI, you will do this for me. If that explicit value exchange is made explicit and communicated, as you said, that establishes that relationship. And the example that I use and I've used before is Google Maps. I have home in there, so Google Maps knows where I live. They also know everywhere I go. However, it's a very clear exchange of value. I give them that information. They can use it for advertising. That's fine. I'm not overly bombarded by it, but in return, they're giving me this awesome app, and especially for me because I'm really terrible at getting, my sense of direction is horrible. So I see that. I think what you're saying, or at least maybe not what you're saying, but what I could kind of buttress onto what you're saying is establish that relationship between vendor and user. And as part of that relationship, if they're going to get something really good out of this, if it's going to make their product behave better, if it's going to allow it to give them more value, be explicit about that, and so that there is an exchange of value, and there's an explicit exchange of value. And I think that would go a long way, along with your other, the communication component, the transparency component, and so forth. I think that would go a long way. Are we on the same wavelength?
You said it very well, Bruce. Thank you. You summarized it very nicely.
So let's talk now a little bit about pressures. Now I know you're right in the middle of it. I'm tangential. I think there's so much publicity. Mostly it's to do with security, and then privacy gets woven in there. I think because a lot of people don't really understand what privacy is, so it gets swept up, with contemporary journalism. It gets swept up with the security, and unfortunately, journalists want to create link bait, and that is those titles, and so they're very provocative, and people are all worried that security with IoT is going to bring down the world. But what are the privacy pressures that you're feeling? I mean, you're right there in the market. What are you feeling? Where do you think things are shifting toward?
Have you ever heard the word FUD? F-U-D. That's fear. That's fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yep.
I just brought a Amazon. What's it called? Echo.
The Echo.
I just brought an Amazon Echo into my house.
Yeah.
And obviously,
I love those things.
Oh, it's a great thing. If you love technology like I do, it's just a great thing. Yeah. But people come in and they'll say, "What is that?" And I show what it does. And there's a component of people that just say, aren't you afraid of that? Aren't you? It's listening all the time. Amazon is going to start throwing things into your basket that you don't. This is it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And it's it's unwarranted. They're not doing that. But now they could, sure. But once again, if I have a better relationship with Amazon, I the consumer, I begin to establish a trust. And I say, yeah, they could do that, but they don't do that. They're smarter than that.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
Of course, once the press gets hold of that, these things make good stories when privacy is compromised or something happens that way. That's a pressure that's always there. Hopefully, that will change to the point where some reporter will discover that you can actually get a pretty good explanation of what privacy is done from many of the IoT vendors. I think that's something that we can look forward to.
No, and I think the FUD is a good point. And it's funny because different people react to it differently. And I think maybe it's the way you explained it is how I think of it in my head, because we haven't purchased the Echo yet, but some good friends of ours have the Echo, and we went in their house and the same kind of experience. We were asking about songs, we're asking about weather, we're asking about this and that, just having fun with it. And I never even for a second thought, that Amazon was going to be using or recording us. One, I don't know, it's not that interesting. It's going to take up a lot of bandwidth and data. So even from the mechanical point of views aside, it was really, I guess in most cases, it's because, yes, I have established, there has been a sense of trust established with Amazon, and until that trust is breached, until there's a security breach, for example, and it's, then you see that it was their fault too. I mean, there's also, I think if you take all the appropriate measures, it's still possible that there's going to be a breach, and I still would not blame Amazon, and I would still use them as an example, and I still would use their product. But it's a good point. But then there was someone else in the room as well that were saying, "Gosh, they didn't say it in the way that you did, but it was there." To paraphrase them, yeah. What about our privacy? What's going on? What are they doing? And it seems where is all this FUD coming from? I see it coming from the press, and again, in the sense of it makes a great story. People are inherently worried about it. There's obviously been a lot of high profile privacy issues, security and privacy issues with, online dating sites more recently, and gaming. But where is this fear, uncertainty, and doubt coming from? Are there other sources beside the popular press that you're seeing?
Well, there's a component of the population who are naturally skeptical of anything. We all know that.
Yes.
There's also the concept that people don't fully understand the difference between security and privacy. And honestly, I haven't done a very good job of explaining it today either. But when, let's say, Target is breached, that's a whole lot different than when an IoT that's taking your blood pressure is breached. Yet, I think the media tends to just smear everybody with the word breached, and all of a sudden anything that is collecting any information online is suspect. I think we need to educate the consumer to know better. And honestly, I think the consumer wants to know better. But in a lot of cases, he's stonewalled. All they do is shove the boilerplate privacy policy in his face and say, here, read this, and then go away.
Right. They're almost resentful, of that as well. I mean, these boilerplates, I've read in places where there's movements that are trying to distill them down to icons. Similar to when I look at my shirt, it has a couple icons there that tell me I can iron it, I can wash it, or I have to dry clean it. Just something to that level. I mean, who's working on that? Is there anyone working on that? Is there any centralized group that's working on something because we've come up, we've talked about this a number of times, these 5 pays and sometimes more. I think, gosh knows how long the Windows 10 privacy statement was, but to simplify it, I mean, I would think that would be one important step toward reducing this fear, uncertainty, and doubt is understanding, and going back to communication, being able to understand that 5-page and maybe distill the most important points down to 5 icons. Have you heard of anything like this? Is there anything like this going on right now in the industry?
Yes, there is. At the risk to be self-serving, the product that we're going to announce in 2 weeks does precisely that.
Does what?
Here's what we do. We take a long list of best practices for IoT.
Yep.
We distill those into what we call best questions. Now, these are questions that an informed consumer would and should ask that IoT vendor. And obviously, there are specific questions that relate to what the product is and the risks associated with that product. All right, so here's a list of best questions. We then put those best questions in a survey and make them available to the vendor. And the vendor fills in answers to the questions. Understand that the questions also there are questions provided from the vendor's standpoint. Okay, it's not just a consumer saying, "Why are you taking this?" We also give the vendor a chance to say, "I am taking this because I'm doing this and that to provide value to you, the consumer." All right.
Okay.
All right. So let's say that survey is then completed. We then
on both sides, you're saying.
On both sides, we build an engine that then makes a report available on your laptop, your desktop, your iPhone in real time, cloud-based. That's what it does. So,
but now the report, though, go to the report. I mean, is this again a simplified report? Is that the value add here?
Yeah, very simplified, and summarizing that information. It's not a full privacy statement that a lawyer would love, but it's a privacy statement that we hope will tell the consumer pretty much what he needs to know at a high level before he deals with this product, and gives the vendor a chance to be part of the conversation as well. So what we're trying to do is to build digital trust between that vendor and his consumer group.
And when is the? I think this is great. Now, when is this exchange of information happening? Obviously, it's in advance, but then how does the consumer see this? I suppose then they could follow your best practices, and you'd put it on the website before they downloaded it. You might
it can be seen anywhere that you can get to the internet. A URL on any device, a URL on a website, a QR code on a label. Remember I talked about pre-buy, a sign on a subway car that you could snap with a QR. Anything that'll get you to our cloud-based engine, will put it out there for you.
Yeah, makes sense.
At any time.
Yeah, and I think we've identified these long. I remember when I was the CEO of my company, I would be paying our lawyers. Gosh, I can't remember. Let me think. 6 hours, maybe a little bit more, and they were being paid at $240 for the associate, $320. Now this goes back a few years ago for one of the partners to look over. I mean, just to build our privacy statement for our website, and then for our individual products. So yeah, I mean, they want you to think you're getting your money's worth. So they're going to be complicated. So I think this simplification is really valuable. And now I'm seeing actually the first time where you can use technology. It may be a very basic way of using technology, but you are using technology for privacy here, and I think that's interesting.
Let me just add, though, Bruce, we are not saying that we're replacing a lawyer. Those rules that still stand there.
Can't get rid of them.
No, but we want to get the message across to the consumer that these are the main events of privacy in our conversation, and let's build some trust together.
Yeah, no, and you're doing a better job communicating than the lawyers, and their job isn't so much to communicate. Their job is to be able to litigate if necessary, and so they have to write it in that way. Last question I have is, who owns the data, the vendor or the customer? When they're collecting data, or is this kind of a case-by-case basis, or what's your perspective on that?
Bruce, I don't know. I'm sorry. I see that as lawyer land. It seems to me that the data, who owns it, changes as it passes through hands. Who owns it changes as it changes in form, from anonymized to de-anonymized to whatever. Honestly, we're techies here. We're building stuff that we want to put into the consumer's hands day after tomorrow, and I'm going to let the lawyers figure that one out. I'm sorry to fall flat on your question, but that's how I see it.
Well, but couldn't you say that it depends on this relationship between the consumer, an explicit relationship between the consumer and the vendor? If, we followed your best practices plus one, then it would be very clear on who owned the data, or at least it'd be very clear on, maybe I'm talking myself out of this, at least it'd be very clear on what's going to be done with the data, and maybe ownership of that data becomes ancillary. Right? If you establish that communication, which is what your guys' product does, you're telling this is how the data is going to be used. Maybe as I'm sort of talking this through, maybe that question of ownership isn't as important as use and what is going to be done with the data versus who owns that data. Or am I kind of skirting the issue too? I don't know.
No, I don't think you are. I think what you're saying is who controls the data and for what purpose. And that's knowing those two things is perfectly, the consumer should know that. But I guess where I'm just sort of thinking out is to say from a legal standpoint, the data is owned by X or Y at any particular point. I think it varies in across all of the IoT situations.
Yeah, no, and I think ownership is one of those things that has to be legally defined. So I'll kind of agree there. I guess I'm just thinking in the cases of when one of the situations when you build an IoT product is that you can be collecting data that can be packaged and monetized separately. Now, if you package that data and monetize it separately, it implies that you own it to do that. And I suppose right now what you're saying and kind of what we're talking ourselves in a circle toward is that it hasn't been defined yet. And therefore, people are maybe doing this without knowing what the laws are, because I think ownership is a legal issue. And we're kind of a little bit in the Wild West until perhaps the law catches up with us. I don't know. What do you think?
I think we maybe are at peril here when we look at something as aggregating data and selling it and making the conclusion that that's all bad. That's not all bad. Right. Just because a vendor does that doesn't mean that he's a black hat. That doesn't mean that your PII is going to get sold up and down the street. That's just what the vendor does. And after all, he's got to make money too. My point is simply this. If the consumer understands that he does that, if the consumer understands why he does that, and what controls and best practices he does, I think everybody's happy, or at least everyone is informed. I'll say that.
Yeah. No, I agree. All right, Dale, where can people find more about you, your company, and this new product you guys are launching?
Well, probably the most effective way is to go to PrivacyCheq.com, PrivacyCheq.com.
All right.
The name of the new product is PrivacyCheq.
PrivacyCheq?
PrivacyCheq. PrivacyNQ. PrivacyCheq is a product designed to put information, privacy information, in the hands of the consumer, on his iPhone, on his cell phone, on his laptop, in real time. And we have high hopes for it. And I thank you for giving me the time to talk about it.
No, you're welcome. And I think what it also does is just establishes that relationship of trust that we were talking about. So in the end, the product is really to establish that trust. I mean, an understanding between the two parties involved. So
the word is sync. I'm sorry. The word is sync. We're trying to synchronize the interests of the vendor and the consumer.
All right. Well, good luck with that, Dale. Thanks a lot for the chat. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
It's been great, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, that was episode 31. For summary links and other valuable resources, go to the show analysis notes. Like always, they can be found at iot-inc.com/podcasts. Well, now I could use your help. We're trying to get this show off the ground, and the best way to get discovered is with iTunes. So if you've enjoyed the episode or found it informative, I'd really appreciate a review. All you have to do is go to iot-inc.com/iTunes, and that'll redirect you to our iTunes page where you can let people know what you think by simply giving this show a star review or leaving a comment. I'd really appreciate that. If you'd like to learn more about the business of the Internet of Things, visit my media site. It can be found at iot-inc.com. There you'll find other podcasts as well as articles, videos, and information about upcoming live events like my stream meetups and webinars. And as always, if you have any ideas or questions, send me an email. My address is bruce@iot-inc.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your path to IoT business be a private one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.